This past week, Venom hit theaters, and immediately it was apparently clear that there was an enormous gap between the critical response to the film and the audience reaction to the film. Now, while there were certainly audience members who agreed with the critics, there was an enormous number of people who loved the film. So earlier this week, I put out a video where I shared my thoughts as to what I think is going on here and asked you to share your theories as to why there is such a big gap. And easily one of the most common things you said is going on here is that Disney pays critics to give their films good reviews and they pay critics to give other studios' films bad reviews. People were quick to point out The Last Jedi, a film that a lot of audience members hated, but the critics have it score up in the 90s. Now, certainly many audience members agreed that it was a very good movie, but there's a lot of people that also hate that movie. They also pointed out Black Panther, whose Rotten Tomatoes score is in the high 90s. So that raises the question, does Disney pay off critics for reviews? Let's talk about it. Now, before we dive into this controversial subject, go ahead and tell me down below in the comment section, what's your answer to that question? Does Disney pay off critics? If you're a yes person, tell me why and kind of what's your evidence. And if you're a no person, go ahead and tell me why you think it is that some of these movies that critics love, that audience didn't like so much. What's the reason for the gap there? I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you're someone that likes to talk movies too much, you're probably in the right place, and consider clicking that subscribe button. With that said, let's dive into our subject at hand, and that's Venom. Why is it that people specifically think that Disney paid critics to give Venom a bad review? Well, what you have to understand is that Disney owns Marvel. They actually own the comic book company in general, and Marvel Studios, who puts out the MCU, they own that as well as a subsidiary studio within the company. But back in the 90s, Marvel, before it was owned by Disney, sold the licensing, the film rights to their films to a bunch of different studios. Sony owns the rights to make films about Spider-Man and his set of characters. The only reason that Spider-Man Homecoming is in the MCU is because they cut a specific deal to make that happen. But Venom, the rights to Venom, are owned by Sony. So the theory at hand is that essentially Marvel and Disney want the rights back to Venom. So they want this Venom movie to flop, and to flop hard. Fantastic Four level bomb. Therefore, Sony doesn't want the rights anymore and sell them back to Disney and Marvel. So there he goes. Disney pays off the critics to give Venom bad reviews, just to trash it, to compare it to Catwoman, to compare it to Fantastic Four, so that it gets bad buzz, so it bombs at the box office. And then naturally on the other side of that, whenever Disney puts out a movie, whether you're talking about Pixar, Star Wars, Marvel, or Disney proper, they pay the critics to give their movies a positive review, naturally because they obviously want their movies to get good reviews and for people to go and see them. So what's my take on this? I have a really hard time believing it at face value. At the end of this video, I'll give some alternative theories as to what I think is kind of going on here and why we see some of these big gaps. But I have a hard time at face value believing that hundreds of movie critics are paid off by Disney to give specific scores to films. When it comes to Rotten Tomatoes, we are talking about hundreds of movie critics for newspapers, for magazines, and for websites and YouTube channels. A wide variety of different sources that are established, that people know who they are. That's who Rotten Tomatoes aggregates to get that Rotten Tomatoes score. And the reason this is hard for me to believe is because essentially you're saying there's hundreds of people that don't have integrity because they're a movie reviewer that takes money to write reviews for other people. And at the same time, they're not willing to then make money going to a major reporter to spill the beans on this, to blow the whistle on all of this. All these people that you're saying are crooked and do things for money won't blow the whistle to make money to become famous, the whistleblower. Likewise, the assumption has to be that either 100% of the people that Disney's offered money have taken the money and not said anything, or there are people out there that wouldn't take the money, but also wouldn't blow the whistle. With that said, if you're aware of a major reviewer that says, yeah, Disney guy came up to me, he was under a trench coat, he pulled out an envelope full of bills and said he'd pay me this money to give Black Panther an A+, if you're aware of someone that's blown the whistle and the story just hasn't gone big or something like that, share it with me. I'm very open to having my mind changed if there's evidence. See, when it comes to situations like this, we're all prone towards confirmation bias. And confirmation bias is the tendency to interpret new evidence as confirmation of one's existing beliefs and theories. We're all prone to do this. Everyone is has this bias inside of us. As new information comes in to explain kind of what's going on, we interpret it in light of our pre-existing theories. So if you're predisposed to believing that Disney is paying off critics for reviews and you see that Venom has a 30% and that the audience score is hovering around 90%, confirmation bias will tell you, look, it's confirmed. Here's more evidence that Disney is paying people off because Last Jedi is still way up here and then Venom's way down here. It's confirmed. But that's not really evidence. That's a theory, and confirmation bias filling in the gaps in it for you. And like I'm just as biased in other directions to confirm my own theories. There's some other problems in the idea that Disney paying off critics, and simply that some of Disney's movies don't get good reviews. Cars 2, Cars 3, the second Alice in Wonderland film that they put out just a few years ago, the last Pirates of the Caribbean film, these movies didn't do well with critics. They would be very much inclined to pay off critics to give those movies positive reviews, but they didn't get positive reviews. Here's a couple of alternative theories. First off, Disney plays it safe. They make movies for broad audiences. That's always what their brand has been. They're very good at making films that are supposed to appeal to a lot of people. That's why they buy properties that can be branded in that sort of way. And so just in general, if you look at what Rotten Tomatoes is, it's not evaluating how good a movie is, it's evaluating what percentage of critics recommend it. It's a binary thing. The critic either recommends it or they don't recommend it. And that score says that 30% of critics recommend Venom, 91% of critics recommend The Last Jedi, but it says nothing about quality. If every single critic gave a movie a 7 out of 10, then it would have a 100% on Rotten Tomatoes, even though they're only giving it like a 7 out of 10. Disney makes movies that are very safely in that 7, 8 out of 10 type of score. You look at a lot of these Marvel movies, they're not reinventing the formula. They're playing it safe, so they make good movies, but a lot of them aren't groundbreaking movies. They're not revolutionizing storytelling. They're not taking any big risks, usually in a lot of these MCU films, but they're very safely going to get a thumbs up from critics. And generally speaking, that's very true. Their films appeal to a lot of people, so those high Rotten Tomato scores match the general public usually. Second reason that I think that you can kind of explain somewhat of what's going on here, especially when it comes to, for example, The Last Jedi and Black Panther, is that critics tend to share a set of values with Disney. And that's to say that Disney, like most companies in Hollywood, it tends to be a little bit to the left. Most critics tend to be a little bit to the left, or a lot to the left in some cases. Whatever language you would use to describe that. And so when Disney makes movies in that tend to direction that have a certain value set in what they're trying to communicate, that is a shared value set that the critics have, in which case they're going to be inclined towards liking what Disney is doing in that regard. And a certain segment of the audience can be frustrated by that. It's in particular in the case of Star Wars: The Last Jedi, where it felt a little bit like they were kind of squeezing kind of weird things in with that casino subplot and things like that just seemed out of place for Star Wars, and it just seemed like they're kind of pushing an agenda in there. That's going to rub a lot of audience members the wrong way when you force it in there like that. And I don't think I'm saying anything divisive or controversial when I say that Disney tends to be the left and critics tend to be the left. I think that's just saying a dog is a dog, and these companies tend to be in that direction and share a certain value set, and therefore you can see that in certain reviews. And the last one is that critics are a little bit out of touch with the general public. And I don't say that as a slam on critics, and it's not really a praise of the audience either. They're just seeing movies in very different ways for some very obvious reasons. Stop and think about the movies that tend to make enormous amounts of money. They appeal to teenagers and adults. They appeal to a very broad audience of people, but a lot of that is also teenagers. And you stop and think some of these movies where these are big gaps between the box office and the critic score. Transformers, Venom, a lot of these types of movies, well, they appeal to teenagers. My 13-year-old nephews are very excited to go see Venom because they want to go see Venom eat people's faces and throw cops around and things like that. They have very different tastes and they have very different discernments when it comes to film and what they're looking for than a 45-year-old film journalist for The New Yorker. And that's not to say that one is better than the other. I think even in this discussion, like critics are these idiots, they're morons that are out of touch. I'm not saying they're morons that are out of touch. I'm just saying that there's a big gap between these two groups of people, and that's okay. If you go to movies to be entertained, that's okay. If film critics go to movies because they're looking for the art and the cinematography, that's okay. Both of these are perfectly valid things to do. Now, if you don't care about cinematography and all that kind of fun stuff, you just want to be entertained, you probably don't need to look at the critics at all. And that's okay. But that doesn't mean what they're doing is invalid. If they start getting condescending, if they start saying these stupid audiences, that's on them. But we shouldn't be calling anyone stupid for having different tastes in movies. We shouldn't be condescending, we shouldn't be rude, we shouldn't be jerks. Just acknowledge some people watch movies because they want to see Venom eat people's faces, and some people watch movies because they want intricate characters with nuance and these character arcs, and they want tragedy. People see movies for different things, and I think that's totally fine. But am I off base? Go ahead and tell me down below. If you just disagree with me, don't just tell me you disagree, tell me why. I am very open to alternative theories, ideas, and evidence. But if you just call me stupid, that's just kind of annoying and frustrating. Be sure to check out that video to the left if you didn't check out my previous video that kind of inspired this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, and keep talking movies too much.